The Fat of the Land by Wilhelmir Stephenson. Chapter 9. The Nature and Early History of Pemmican. Pemmican is controversial. An admiral of the United States Navy has said it is the best concentrated food known. He believes it to contain more nourishment per ounce than any other complete food, and considers it to be the only condensed ration upon which a man can maintain his health and strength indefinitely, using it as the main dish at every meal 365 days in the year. He adds that in 20 years of use he and his men never tired of it. Yet nutritionists of the United States Navy are responsible for instructions that pemmican shall not be used in that service. A general of the United States Army, who used pemmican and studied the history of its use through a century by fur traders and pioneers, has said, "It formed a very palatable as well as nutritious food." But Army dietitians reported during World War II that they have tried it out, and that it is so unpalatable soldiers will not eat it, that men on this food lose their strength in 3 days, that they become ill from it, and that they would rather starve than eat it. A number of scientists are on record that pemmican is good in cold weather, but unsuitable in hot climates. But Europeans first encountered this food invention of the Plains Indians in the Texas, Missouri, Dakota, Manitoba sector, where midsummer temperatures go above 120 degrees in the shade occasionally, and above 100 degrees frequently. Pemmican there was chiefly a summer food because it was a travel food, and journeys were usually made in summer. Its most impressive record as the exclusive diet, or nearly so, of large numbers of men for long periods, is from transportation crews of the trade working 12 to 18 hours a day and straight through the noon period with its scorching or steaming heat. For British Army use, pemmican has been recommended as a standard ration by officers of long familiarity with rank as high as Major General. It has been recommended for United States Army use by officers of long pemmican experience, with rank up to Brigadier General, but these recommendations have never been accepted by those in control of Army commissariats in either Britain or the United States. So far as I know, the only army that formally approved this American invention for use in the Second World War was the German. And when he says American invention, he means Native American. The extreme supporters of pemmican recommend it as the most concentrated food known to man, or possible within the modern concepts of physiological and chemical science. They say that it is a complete food in the sense that it will keep a hard-working man in top form for any length of time in any climate. They maintain, indeed, that it is the only concentrated food which ever has been tried out by large numbers of men for long periods and which has met these specifications. But those who oppose pemmican say that it is not a complete food, that it is not a wholesome food, and that it is not capable of maintaining full health and strength indefinitely. The advocates of pemmican say that it is as palatable as other standard foods, such as bread or roast beef. Those who oppose it say that it is so unpalatable that this quality by itself would prevent its use. There appears to be no disagreement among historians of the North American frontier that pemmican is among the most preservable of foods. Cases are on undisputed record where packages, shielded only by raw hide, were in good condition after 10, 20, and more years, without any preservative such as salt, and without protection from the rain of summer other than that given by the leather covering. A premise being that the bags would be in such position, as on a scaffolding, that they would have a chance to dry out between showers. These preservability records are chiefly from the Dakotas of the United States and from the prairie provinces of Canada, thus from a climate suitable for corn-wheat agriculture. Yet scientists during World War II have stated that the control of enzyme action in pemmican is as yet an unsolved problem, and that the food will spoil rapidly unless canned. Proponents say it is a great merit of pemmican that it may be cooked, but it does not require cooking, and that it is good to eat under practically all conditions. Opponents say that pemmican is never, properly speaking, fit to eat. Consequently, its readiness for use is an irrelevant factor. Pemmican seems to be the only food about which a war has ever been fought in North America. At least it is the only one to have a war named for it. The Pemmican War of 1814 to 1821, although mainly in Canada, spilled over into the United States, and reference to it can be found in works such as the Dictionary of American History. The disputes between those who wanted to use pemmican in the Second World War and those who were determined that it should not be used became so emotional, violent, and broadly spread at home and abroad that it was suggested we had a war within a war, the Second Pemmican War within the Second World War. All these are introductory statements trying to forecast what the shooting is all about in this row within the armed forces and between the current dietitians. I shall document the points as we go along. It is considered that the first reference to pemmican by a European is found in the account of the 1540 to 1542 Coronado expedition into what is now the southwestern part of the United States. We quote from the translation by the historian and bibliographer George Parker Winship in the 14th Annual Report of the Bureau of Ethnology of the Smithsonian Institution, Washington, 1896, pages 527 to 528. Quote, "They dry the flesh of the buffalo in the sun, cutting it thin like a leaf, and when dry they grind it like meal to keep it and make a sort of sea soup of it to eat. A handful thrown into a pot swells up so as to increase very much. They season it with fat, which they always try to secure when they kill a cow." End quote. The published authorities, without any exception I have seen, speak of this as a reference to pemmican, and usually as the first reference to pemmican in the known literature. But on its surface, the passage seems to fit more nearly pounded meat, an ingredient of pemmican which is described hereafter. Nor can the first use of pemmican by its eventual chief patrons, the overland explorers and the fur traders, be determined to everyone's satisfaction. The favored man, place, and date would seem to be Henry Kelsey, the present Saskatchewan district, in the year 1691. In his paper, The Journal of Henry Kelsey, presented to the Historical and Scientific Society of Manitoba, 24th May, 1928, Charles Napier Bell supposed that Kelsey was not merely the first white man to see the buffalo within the borders of what is now Canada, but also the first to observe the making of pemmican from buffalo meat, perhaps the first to observe the making of any sort of pemmican. The view that Kelsey was the first to use pemmican is seemingly adopted by Professor Arthur S. Morton in his History of the Canadian West, 1870 to 1871, who says, "Kelsey must have turned to spend the winter, 1691 to 1692, on the prairies northeast of Saskatoon, hunting buffalo to procure pemmican for the return journey, and trapping furs with the natives." Thousands of Europeans used pemmican during the exploration and colonization stages of North America. Of these, only a few kept diaries that have been preserved to us. A still smaller number wrote books. I cite testimony gathered from these published and unpublished documents, quoting chiefly men whose standing is widely recognized, men who are known as dependable witnesses in general, and who should therefore be reliable in the particular case now before us, the debate concerning the advantages and drawbacks of this food. But first I must describe and define, to show what the witnesses are testifying about. However, before quoting the definitions and descriptions of the standard authorities, let me emphasize what some of them merely imply, that in the way the Indians and early whites looked on pemmican, it had only two ingredients, lean and fat. Any others were considered accidental and extraneous, such as hairs and fragments of bone, or else as flavoring, which with the Indians was dried berries, and with the early whites might be salt, raisins, sugar, etc. At the height of pemmican's use by whites, around 1820, from 1% to 5% of it will have been of the flavored or holiday sort. the cake variant of the bread of the wilderness. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary, 1939 edition, gives as the first definition, quote, "Among the North American Indians, lean buffalo meat or venison cut in thin slices, dried in the sun, pounded fine, mixed with melted fat, and packed in sacks of hide." End quote. For a second definition, Webster has also a similar preparation, as of dried beef, suet, raisins, and sugar, used by explorers, etc. From these definitions, Webster derives a third, information or thought condensed into little compass. Perhaps not wholly because the dictionary is more voluminous, but rather because the word made a stronger impression on the British, there is a longer and more detailed account of pemmican in the Oxford. That the British were so impressed with pemmican was perhaps because, among the leading families, a favorite investment of the 18th and 19th centuries was in shares of the Hudson's Bay Company, and the success of the company, as is explained hereafter, depended to a considerable extent on pemmican. A saying of wide use in the United States was, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," for the colonists wanted to farm, and both the Indian hunter and the animals he hunted were in the farmer's way. To the Hudson's Bay Company, which then controlled most of what is now Canada and part of what is now the United States, the only good Indian was a live Indian, for he hunted, trapped, and sold furs to the company. For business success, if for no other reason, they had to keep the Indian alive, which made it necessary to store up food in a good year against the scarcity of a bad one. So when game was plenty, they encouraged the Indians to sell them as much pemmican as possible, which they accumulated in the post store rooms, to be sold back to the Indians, in due course, at a profit. The stockholders of the company were in the main the nobility and gentry of Britain. They were travelers, readers of books, students of what it was that made the company's stock such a good investment, so that naturally they became pemmican conscious. The explorers of wild North America were much bigger heroes in remote England than practically at home in Virginia, New York, or eastern Canada. Books on or by the great pioneers, like Samuel Hearne, who discovered the copper mine, Alexander Mackenzie, who discovered the Mackenzie, John Franklin, the tragic hero, and many another, were printed in England and widely read. Even following the Louisiana Purchase, United States explorers like Lewis and Clark were more eagerly published and more widely read beyond the Atlantic than in their own country. This, I imagine, or something like it, is back of the long and interesting discussion of pemmican which appears in the Oxford Dictionary. Pemmican, a preparation made by certain North American Indians consisting of lean meat, dried, pounded, and mixed with melted fat, so as to form a paste, and pressed into cakes. Hence, beef similarly treated, and usually flavored with currants or the like, for the use of Arctic explorers, travelers, and soldiers, as containing much nutriment in little bulk, and keeping for a long time. References to pemmican. 1801, Sir A. Mackenzie. References to pemmican. 1801, Sir A. Mackenzie. The provision called pemmican, on which the Chippewayans and other savages in the north of America chiefly subsist in their journeys. 1827, Cronin. Pemmican, a concentrated essence of meat dried by a fire of oak and elm wood, so as to reduce 6 pounds of the best beef to 1 pound. 1835, Longfellow. Then on pemmican they feasted, pemmican and buffalo marrow. 1869, E. A. Parks, Practical Hygiene. The pemmican of the Arctic voyagers is a mixture of the best beef and fat dried together. Also, figure of speech. Pemmican, extremely condensed thought, or literary matter containing much information in a few words. For example, a sort of intellectual pemmican. Sir Bramswell's address is really a wonderful specimen of thought and knowledge, reduced to pemmican. Also, pemmicanize, to condense, compress, squeeze. The modern man is rarely inclined to read his history in many volumes. He much prefers it pemmicanized. The Encyclopedia Britannica, 14th edition, says, Pemmican, a North American Indian word for meat prepared in such a way as to contain the greatest amount of nourishment in the most compact form. As made by the Indians, it was composed of the lean parts of the meat, dried in the sun, and pounded or shredded and mixed into a paste with melted fat. In spite of these definitions, there occurs now and then, as the literature is studied, a confusion of terms. So we build up our own definitions and descriptions. The first step in the making of pemmican, as correctly given by the dictionaries and the Britannica, is that the lean is sliced thin and dried. To make the drying effective, all fat should be removed. The lean is then about what is called biltong in South Africa and jerky throughout the Americas, except that these, especially jerky, may sometimes have more or less fat adhering. With most of the pemmican, the drying was by sun and wind, so the speed and effectiveness of the process depended on season and climate. In regions of cold winters, for instance the Mackenzie Valley, one might perhaps speak of frost drying. If at temperatures varying from 30 to 60 degrees below zero, a wet handkerchief is suspended from a tree, it dries in something between 3 and 10 days. The lower the temperature, the slower the drying. Thus, if thin slices of meat were hung up in winter, under such conditions, they would dry eventually, but the time required would be several weeks, even months if the pieces were at all thick. There would be the advantage in winter of no danger from maggots or decay. In a rainy season, or if there was a great hurry, the drying might be done over a slow fire. This was the method of the British when they came to make pemmican at home for the use of their soldiers, sailors, and explorers. Sometimes in a wet season meat was suspended within the tepee and became smoked incidentally. There were sections of North America where smoking was deliberate, as part of the drying, most likely in places where the climate was damp. The next pemmican step was to pound the dried lean into shreds, with a wooden mallet on a wooden block, or on a stone, or with a stone hammer on wood or stone. To catch all the shreds and powder, a buffalo or other hide was spread out, and upon it was laid the stone or wooden block that formed the anvil. At this stage we have what the Hudson's Bay Company referred to as pounded meat. It was stored in bags of any sort, usually suspended within the tepee or warehouse. If kept outdoors, it would be shielded from the rain by leather coverings. Next came the making of special rawhide bags for the pemmican. The hide was that of the animal which was being used, buffalo with buffalo meat, caribou with caribou meat. The buffalo bag was about the size of one of our pillow-cases, with the hair out. When filled, it was supposed to weigh 90 pounds. The actual weight usually ran from 80 to 100 pounds, with the average not far from 90. The bag prepared, the Indian would fill it lightly and fluffily with shredded lean, somewhat as we fill a pillow with feathers. Suet was then heated, and, in some cases at least, was brought to the temperature used in frying doughnuts. This very liquid fat was poured into the bag so that it percolated everywhere, a film of it covering every shred of lean. According to some descriptions, it appears that the fat was barely liquid. In that case, a small amount of shredded lean would be put in the bag, a small amount of fat poured on it, and the whole stirred. Then there would be a second layer of pounded meat and a second layer of fat, and so on until the bag was full. In still other cases, the fat, also barely liquid, was kneaded with the pounded meat in a bowl somewhat as bread dough is handled in making loaves. Handfuls of the resulting mixture were then stuffed into the bags. The sack filled, its mouth was sewn up, and the seams were rubbed with tallow to seal them. Then, before the fat became hard, the bag was flattened out by trampling upon it, or through some other form of pressure, to the ordinary thickness of 6 or 7 inches. When the fat had set thoroughly, the bags were piled up like cordwood, the lowest layer being kept from the ground by stones or pieces of wood. Such a bag was known as a piece of pemmican, and was looked upon as of convenient weight for backpacking. It became the practice of the Hudson's Bay Company to divide any goods that were to be carried by men on their backs over mountains, river portages, etc., into parcels of 90 pounds, so that eventually the word piece came to mean a weight of 90 pounds, and might consist in goods of any nature that were transported by canoe and portage in summer, or by dog sled in winter. As has been said, most of the journeys of the 18th and early 19th century fur trade were made in summer. It is the belief of some writers that pemmican was originally a military invention, used by Indian scouts and raiding parties, where each man had to carry his own food that would suffice for many days, and where it was necessary that provisions be light for easy and rapid travel. Pemmican had as well the other most necessary qualities of a military ration, that it would keep under practically any condition, and that it could be eaten without building a fire, the smoke of which would be visible to the enemy by day, as the flame would be by night. However, pemmican was also to the Indian a food that could be preserved from a season of plenty to one of scarcity. This, as is dwelt upon hereafter, became an important though secondary feature of its use in the fur trade of the plains. The idea that pemmican would last 5 years, which is encountered frequently in the writings, would seem to derive from a usual practice of the fur traders to keep buying pemmican from the Indians through 4 or 5 successive years. Then they were likely to quit buying on the score of having in their storehouses by then a large enough stock to take care of the next famine. Although the expression, "will keep good 5 years," is frequent in the books, there are also numerous references to pemmican which was 10 or 20 years old and still in excellent condition. The reason why pemmican kept good indefinitely was, first, because the water had been dried out of the lean, so that, as long as it remained dry, it was preserved on the principle of mummification. Every lean particle had a coating of fat, which protected it from moisture and from the air. The rawhide of which the bag was made had the same preservability that is found in vellum manuscripts, some of which are 1,000 or more years old, and still of good appearance in libraries. Air could not penetrate this rawhide, partly because the inside of it at least was greased. Air would not come through the seams, for they were proofed by essentially the same method that frontier housewives have used with preserve jars, which they sealed with tallow when they did not have wax. Quite apart from all the theoretical explanations, we have the clear fact, attested by witnesses from every decade of 150 years, and from a number of different North American climates, that pemmican remains for 10, 20, 30 years as good as the day it was made, if once properly made. Because it was easy to keep and to carry, pemmican was an important commercial item before the time of the whites, and Indian tribes that did not make it came from afar to buy. This trade was barter, of course. Sometimes dried salmon and other fish pemmicans made on or near the Pacific coast were exchanged for jerky and for pemmican made of buffalo, elk, moose, or caribou farther east. The fish pemmican was a soft paste in bags, for the fat was an oil. It was not exclusively a West Coast product. We have records of fish pemmican from the Lake Winnipeg country, from Hudson Bay, and elsewhere. 4 main grades or sorts are recognized in the literature: winter and summer pemmican, plain and berry pemmican. There was also fine pemmican. Winter pemmican was made in the autumn, a difficult season for drying meat. Accordingly, winter pemmican might or might not be of lean that was dry enough to keep indefinitely. Since the Indians did not usually travel much in winter, weight did not greatly matter, nor did keeping qualities, for the chill of the weather would act as a preservative. What the narratives of exploration and the fur trade speak of as bad pemmican, spoiled pemmican, etc., was usually winter pemmican that had been kept into the summer. Summer pemmican was made in the spring or summer, and was the kind described above, in which 6 pounds of fresh lean were dried down to about a pound of jerky. By the usual half-and-half relation of dehydrated lean to rendered fat, a pound of summer pemmican represented 3 pounds of fresh lean, to which had been added half a pound of suet. Plain pemmican, whether summer or winter, had no components but fat and lean. Berry pemmican differed in that it was flavored with dried fruit of some sort, in the early days usually with chokeberries or Saskatoon berries. Most authors seem to think that this flavored kind was in use by the Indians before European contact, but some writers have suggested that the inclusion of berries may have been upon European initiative, an attempt by whites to make it resemble more nearly foods to which they were used, such as plum duff. Within historic time, Europeans have never been exclusive meat eaters, but seemingly they would have liked to be, for it appears from the social history of Europe that meat was the admired food. The trouble was that it was usually hard to come by. In medieval times, only a few of the nobility and gentry had as much meat as they would have liked. It is a commonplace of the literature in the late Middle Ages and early modern times that the best food was meat. Reference is made elsewhere to the diary entry of Pepys that he had a sumptuous fine dinner of 7 courses, 6 of which were meat, and the 7th meat and cheese. That was the kind of dinner those had who could manage it. Only a few of the Europeans, however, were nobility and gentry. The rest lived on bread, porridge, and garden produce. The child of the commoner grew to maturity liking these foods, for they were the ones to which he was used. The Europeans who settled North America were chiefly commoners, and so had an inherited taste for bread and porridge. On the Atlantic seaboard, as in Europe, cereals and garden foods were abundant and therefore cheap. So the transplanted Europeans who came in touch with pemmican on the western plains were men who liked bread and porridge, pie and cake, fruit and garden vegetables. In order to make pemmican seem a little more like what they were used to, they would blend it with fruits or cereals. Alternatively, they would use it as they customarily used meat, along with bread, potatoes, things of that sort. The balance of opinion seems to be that the Indians did have berry pemmican originally, and that they looked upon it not as a standard food, but as a special dish for celebrations or to entertain a visitor. Through the combined force of Europeans wanting foods more nearly like what they were used to, and the slowly developing notion that diets ought to be varied, there began the practice of using berry pemmican as a standard ration. An early account of this is in the narratives of the search for Sir John Franklin, about the middle of the 19th century, when large quantities of pemmican were made in England, some of it sweetened with sugar, some flavored with raisins or currants, some with both sugar and dried fruit. This was for the use of British sailors and other members of the expeditions not previously familiar with pemmican. There is no definite evidence as to when commercial makers first began to blend with cereals, but this practice was not favored prior to about 1900. Admiral Peary was, for instance, badly annoyed when he found that a dealer had pawned off on him an article that contained pea meal as an ingredient. Whether this was before or after the turn of the century is beyond determination, but in Secrets of Polar Travel, published in 1917, Peary refers to one of his expeditions without dating it, and then says, quote, "On a still later expedition I was persuaded to purchase some so-called pemmican of a foreign make. This, after I had sailed, and it was too late to remedy the error, I found to be largely composed of pea flour." End quote. The introduction of ingredients like pea meal was, then, for 3 reasons. People like what they are used to, and most Europeans are used to a certain amount of cereals. There was a growing belief in the advantage of variety, and variety is increased if a cereal is added to meat. And, finally, there was coming in the theory, discussed elsewhere, that fat burns only in the flame of the carbohydrates, meaning that the fat element of pemmican could not be utilized unless there was along with the fat enough carbohydrate to do the burning. There were plain pemmicans that varied according to the care in the making, and according to the sort of fat used. If it was to be the best kind, fine pemmican, one would be very careful to pick out and remove from the pounded meat any pieces of tendon or fragments of bone, and might even assort the lean, putting into one batch only the finely shredded portion and the fine powder. Thus fine pemmican was plain pemmican made with the greatest care, with the best lean ground fine and with the best fat, usually marrow fat. It is not in the literature, but can safely be inferred, that fine pemmican must have had the disadvantage of not keeping so well, for fat grows rancid more quickly the softer it is. The necessary detailed information as to the keeping qualities of the various buffalo fats, even as to what the Plain Indians believed, is not available. The Eskimos of northwestern Canada believe, for the caribou, that the fats which resist rancidity best are from the kidneys and from the back slab, the layer on the back that extends from the horns to the tail and a little way down along the flanks. Kidney fat is the hardest. Less hard is the fat from the ribs and brisket. Softest of all, and most easily spoiled, is the marrow fat. If in commercial manufacture it is desired to make full use of a merit of pemmican considered important in the olden days, that it would keep for years under almost any conditions, it will be necessary to study what sort of fat to use. Butter and lard become rancid easily, and they are messy to handle. Some form of tallow would be used, certainly. It is probable that from this angle the best of all would be mutton tallow, since the harder the fat, the less subject it is to rancidity. Furthermore, many nowadays dislike greasy food, or think they do, and butter and lard are more greasy than tallow. The kidney tallow of sheep will be the driest and the least greasy, and it is about the most nearly tasteless of domestic animal fats. However, rendered beef kidney suet, which to many is the most agreeable of the beef fats, may be the practical ingredient for commercial pemmican. Some pemmican made with it, and canned on the theory that it might otherwise grow rancid, was opened by Colonel E. W. Wentworth, of Armour and Company, in the summer of 1943, and kept open in a desk drawer of his Chicago office, subject to increase and decrease of steam heat as well as to seasonal and daily changes of weather. After nearly a year it was still perfect in July of 1944. In my own New York place a can of the same pemmican was open 2 years, from 1943 to 1945, without developing rancidity or suffering any other deterioration which could be detected. Butter or lard, so processed that they would be as hard as the tallows and no more greasy, could be used, but there is at present dispute as to the digestibility of at least some of the chemically hardened fats. That pemmican rightly made will keep indefinitely under almost any conditions is testified by many. However, this meaning is usually taken solely by inference from the trend of a narrative, as when it is said that so many pieces were left at a certain place under certain conditions and were picked up so many years later and used. One of the first of the explicit testimonies is that of the famous Alexander Henry, the Younger, whose journals are published in the 3-volume New Light on the Early History of the Greater Northwest, New York, 1897. For the passage quoted below, it is necessary to keep in mind the climate of North Dakota, especially as to temperatures. According to Climate and Man, of the United States Department of Agriculture, one of the most interesting books that has been published by our government, the hottest day ever recorded in the state of North Dakota reached 122 degrees in the shade. There are few years which do not see 105 degrees, and probably no summers that do not reach 100 degrees somewhere in the region. The most humid section of the state is the Red River Valley, and Henry, writing in December, is speaking of pemmican that had been stored over the summer of 1803 near Pembina, right at the river. Quote, I had a few bags remaining from last spring, which had been lying all summer in a heap covered with a leathern tent, and never had been stirred or turned in a damp storehouse. I was apprehensive that it was spoiled, from the complaints made by my friends about the bad quality of the lower Red River pemmican, but surprised to find every bag excellent. This was clear proof to me that the bad pemmican must have come from another quarter. I suspect Portage la Prairie, as I am confident my method of mixing and preparing it is good. The explanation here given for bad pemmican runs through nearly or quite every fur trade account of spoiled pemmican, that it had been carelessly made, or that it had been made with deliberate intent to cheat through leaving water in, so that it would bring more when sold by the pound. Sometimes the explanation was that winter pemmican had been misrepresented to be summer pemmican. Most inventions, even the ones considered epoch-making, like mechanical flight, are arrived at by a combination of previously known facts and principles, so that the Patent Office sometimes has difficulty in showing that the greatest inventions are inventions at all. This would have been the case with pemmican, had there been a Patent Office to which rival claimants from among the Plains Indians could have submitted their evidence. The drying of lean meat is the initial step in the invention, and this stride was probably first taken by nature without the assistance of man. For meat that clings to bones of animals which have been devoured by wolves, and, indeed, small animal bodies, as a fish thrown up on the beach, or a squirrel that dies among the branches of a tree, may be entirely, or partly, so dehydrated, whether by slow drying through the intense cold of a long northern winter, or quick drying in a hot, desert-like climate of summer, that the preservation will be indefinite, a natural mummification. When there is skin on the mummified meat, another step in the pemmican invention has been taken. The protection which dry rawhide gives through shedding rain, and at least partly excluding oxygen. Accordingly, the basic invention, called jerky through the Americas and biltong in Africa, and by the equivalent of dried meat in the languages of many peoples, is ancient and of worldwide use. A second long step toward pemmican would come about through the toughness and hardness of jerky. Lean meat, dry enough to last even in a damp and warm climate, is so hard that it is slow and difficult to chew with the best of teeth. It is particularly unsuitable for young children, who do not as yet have their teeth, and for old people who have lost them. The natural answer was pounding the meat. At first this was, no doubt, usually done with individual pieces just before eating. Later it would be found practical to make quantities of pounded meat and to store it in bags or boxes. But anyone who tries it will discover that pounded meat is dry and difficult to swallow, while if pinches of it are dipped into water, the result is a rather tasteless food. The flavor and feel in the mouth are much better if wads of pounded meat are dipped into melted fat, or into a fat that is liquid by nature, as a vegetable or animal oil. Accordingly, it is a universal practice that people dip the shredded lean into fat before placing in the mouth. The next best thing is to bite off small pieces of suet, tallow, butter, or whatever fat is available, to mix in the mouth with the shredded lean as it is chewed. The dipping of pounded meat into fat at meals would naturally lead a housewife to prepare dishes where the fat and lean were already mixed. If not finished at a given meal, this would harden into a cake, and that would be pemmican. At the next meal it might be warmed up to its original softness, or it might be used cold, somewhat like our hunks of bread or slabs of eating chocolate. The final step in the invention would be to make the pemmican in quantity, and to save it, not against the next meal, but against the next journey, or a future year of bad hunting. So the Plains Indians made it in quantity, placed it in rawhide bags, and stored it by protecting it from dogs and damp. It was not always considered necessary to shield the pile of bags from a rainstorm, for the rawhide covers were waterproof, and their wet outsides would dry off during the next clear spell. The minimum protection needed was the presence of stones or sticks underneath the lowest tier of bags, to keep them out of the mud. From the point of view of a traveler, pemmican has a series of advantages over jerky and suet, or pounded meat and suet, that are kept separately but in practice are eaten together. Jerky has the disadvantage that, although the lean has been reduced to 1/6 of its former weight, the bulk has not been reduced by nearly as much, for when strips of dried meat are tied into bundles, the pieces will not fit smoothly against each other. There are wide open spaces between, as with a bundle of corrugated tree bark. Another difficulty of jerky is that, although it will shed the water of a quick rain shower, it is not exactly waterproof. It will absorb moisture gradually, even from damp air, thus gaining in weight and bulk, while at the same time it becomes susceptible to mold and decay. The difficulties with pounded meat are worse. It is still more bulky than the jerky from which it was made. It is less water-resistant and spoils even more easily. Where prices are mentioned in connection with the fur trade, jerky is never quoted at more than half the pemmican rate per pound. But the tallow that was eaten with the jerky was sometimes priced as high as the pemmican itself, for it was a commonplace that jerky alone is not a complete food. There has to be fat with it if in a hunting country, or cereals with it when agricultural products were substituted. Now and then a writer says explicitly, and the same is frequently implied, that no one would eat jerky if pemmican were available, unless to save the pemmican. Still, many writers of the frontier are loud in praise of jerky in comparison with European preserved meats. One of these is Professor James Frank Dobie of the University of Texas, author of historical and other books on the early Southwest. After disclaiming special knowledge of pemmican, thus implying he has had no personal experience with it, he says in a letter of August 7, 1944, quote, "Nothing will stay with a man longer than sun-dried beef. This Packer-prepared chipped beef is moonshine compared to good old jerky." End quote. Pemmican combines all the advantages that jerky and pounded meat have over fresh or salt-preserved meat. It is less bulky than the separate tallow and jerky from which it is made. It is waterproof in itself. It excludes air through its own nature, and, especially when protected by rawhide, is proof against weather and bacteria under most conditions of handling and of climate. It is easy to chew because the lean has been shredded, and the shreds have been combined with fat. That pemmican is a complete food, maintaining full health and strength indefinitely, the Indians had doubtlessly known for centuries before the Europeans first borrowed it and made it their bread of the wilderness, the cornerstone of success in exploring and developing the interior of this continent. The chief deterrent to the use of pemmican has always been its costliness, in labor and time. The only lean suitable was that which was so free of tendons and connective tissues that it would powder or shred easily, and the process was so long that some early writers say it required 2 buffalo to feed the Indian's family and dogs while they made a single piece of pemmican, 90 pounds. The common figure is that a buffalo weighing perhaps 1,000 pounds on the hoof would make 1 piece. Naturally, then, pemmican was used only at feasts, on journeys, or in time of famine. The food cheapest, as measured by the labor required, was eaten first. This was meat that was fresh, either because recently killed, or through frost preservation. Next in order came jerky and pounded meat, each supplemented with fat taken separately, as has been described. The longest hoarded, last to be eaten, was the pemmican. In that pioneer movement of the 19th century which colonized the middle and west of the United States and Canada, it was first the explorer, then the fur trader, last the stock rancher and plowman. In the first and second of these stages, pemmican was a large factor, so that its nature, use, and influence are of consequence to those historians who devote themselves to discovery and settlement. It is the frontier historians, then, who study the role of pemmican. One of these historians, author of The Year of Decision, 1846, and many other books and articles that deal with the early history of the Plains and the Rockies, is Bernard Devoto, a Harvard man born in Utah and thus presumably combining an understanding of East and West. Replying to a questionnaire on pemmican, he wrote a letter, some of which is used here, another part later. Quote, "My notions about pemmican are those of a layman who has studied the Plains Indians, and more especially the white trappers and traders, the mountain men, for a good many years. Such as they are, I'm glad to set them forth. I wanted to write to you a good many years ago, when your experiments with an exclusively meat diet were published, for it seemed to me that the history of the West confirmed you up to the hilt. Pemmican is by far the best concentrated food I have heard about in detail. The only other one in American history that appears to have had any merit is the one, variously named, which was made from pulverized parched corn. But it clearly was nothing to use steadily, and it clearly caused flatulence and digestive disorders. Absolutely certainly, pemmican was infinitely better. I should say that the historical evidence for pemmican is overwhelming. A food used so universally and over so long a period and by so many different kinds and conditions of people must have been an excellent food. Pemmican was by far the favorite meat of the white mountain men, who except for a couple of weeks a year were exclusively meat eaters. As soon as soldiers and emigrants come into the West, they highlight the normal good health of the trappers by developing dozens of ailments that the trappers never suffer from. Well, a good part of the time they were not living on fresh meat. They regularly stopped to make meat whenever they encountered a buffalo herd. That is, they dried it, by sun if possible, by gentle smoking if the weather happened to be bad. My impression is that the trappers did not often stop to make pemmican themselves, but they traded for it very eagerly whenever they found Indians who had it, and the Indians seem to have made pemmican almost as regularly as they dried meat. It is certain that both Indians and trappers lived on dried meat or pemmican for very long stretches at a time, for stretches repeated so often that in some they amounted to a very considerable fraction of every year. It is equally certain that both Indians and trappers greatly preferred pemmican to merely dried meat." End quote. I find by a canvass of the literature that, as frontier historian, Devoto speaks for his craft. So it may appear that there is a need for no further witness. But there is need, for we are discussing an American food invention which is now so far forgotten by most of our countrymen as to its origin, nature, and history, that many think it a food useful only in cold weather and chiefly in polar exploration, if they have heard of it at all. Therefore I supplement the presentation of a historian, who has approached this subject more from the human point of view, by quoting a biologist, whose chief interest was not in the men who used the pemmican, but in the animal that formerly produced it, the buffalo. William Temple Hornaday, 1854 to 1937, zoologist, was in his later years director of the New York Zoological Park. He was author of several books and lengthy reports, one of the most important of which is The Extermination of the American Bison, with a sketch of its discovery and life history. Later reissued separately, this work was first published in the United States National Museum in its report for 1887. I quote from page 447. Out of the enormous waste of good buffalo flesh, one product stands forth as a redeeming feature: pemmican. Although made almost exclusively by the half-breeds and Indians of the Northwest, it constituted a regular article of commerce of great value to overland travelers, and was much sought for as long as it was produced. Its peculiar staying powers, due to the process of its manufacture, which yielded a most nourishing food in a highly condensed form, made it of inestimable value to the overland traveler who must travel light or not at all. The study of the buffalo, from which this has been quoted, deals with the animal from Mexico City on the south to Great Slave Lake on the north. Hornaday is therefore not thinking in terms of winter, for there is little winter in some of the country he is discussing. It is part of the history of the North American frontier that meat has been used to take the place of bread ceremonially as well as dietetically, and this would naturally happen also with that preparation from meat which is called pemmican. In the famous papal brief of 1492, doubtless written before the Pope heard about the return of Columbus from his West Indies voyage of that year, Alexander VI bewails the sorry straits of the Church beyond the Atlantic, in Greenland, for he possessed reliable information that among the churches in this most remote of bishoprics, the poor people, having no grain in their whole country, had been forced to substitute dried fish and milk for bread and wine. The Pope is not explicit, and it is possible to interpret the reference to mean that he is sorry the Greenlanders have to use dried fish and milk for food in place of bread and wine. But the whole tenor of the letter is that he worries over the spiritual rather than the mundane welfare of these remote Christians, and so he has been understood to deplore the inadequacy of the symbolism where fish and milk instead of bread and wine are used in the sacrament to represent the body and blood of our Lord. This document of 1492, published by the Vatican in connection with the Chicago's World Fair of 1892, is considered to embody the first known reference to the use of the flesh of animals in the New World to take the place of bread and sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church. As I have said, fur trade journals and other records speak of pemmican as the bread of the wilderness. And this resemblance in use, indeed also a resemblance to black or brown bread in appearance, logically appealed as much to the early missionary as to the early merchant. Perhaps not so very sound linguistically, but of historical significance, is the contention that the word pembina, usually considered to be from the same root as pemmican, meant sacred bread, for this harks back to the importance of pemmican to the early missionaries of the Plains country, chiefly Roman Catholic and usually French, and to their acceptance of pemmican as the frontier equivalent of bread. After descanting upon this interpretation of Pembina, in connection with the trading post of Pembina, the pemmican capital of the fur country, Linda M. Slaughter says, in Leaves from Northwestern History, published in the first volume of the Collections of the State Historical Society of North Dakota, quote, "In the absence of bread, the priests who came from Minnesota and Canada before the establishment of missions on this side of the border to accompany the half-breeds and natives on their annual hunts, used pemmican as a substitute for bread in the administration of the sacrament of Holy Communion while out on the prairies." End quote. In this quotation, Mrs. Slaughter deals with the period around and after 1800 in that section of the present United States territory, the Red River Valley of Minnesota and North Dakota, which suffered together with the prairie provinces of Canada the bloody turbulence of the Pemmican War, which started in 1814. Mrs. Slaughter. Her last name is Slaughter. That sucks. All right, well, what do you think about pemmican so far? Leave a comment. Oh, and at the end of chapter 9, I forgot to mention, it says something about how the buffalo had all disappeared, so they had to use other food. They had to store like grains instead of pemmican because the buffalo were all gone. And I just wanted to point out, in case you were not familiar with the history of buffalo in North America, that basically the United States government purposely exterminated the buffalo so that it would be easier to control the population of Native Americans. Both, so it would be easier to control how many of them there were, and easier to control the ones that were alive. You control the food, you control the people, and this is still relevant today, in case you're not aware of what's happening in the Netherlands, for example. Anti-farming policies in the name of being green and decreasing nitrogen and carbon. Everyone's going to starve if people don't wake up and fight back. Anyway, hope you like that chapter. Next chapter is chapter 10, the First Pemmican War. And then there's 3 more chapters about pemmican until we get to the Second Pemmican War. Yeah, I take my time at the end of these videos because it's the end, and if you don't want to listen to me ramble, you can just go to the next chapter or wait for the next chapter. Alright. Hope you're having a good day. Peace.